My name is Barbara, and I'm 64 years old. Standing here in my wedding dress, white lace flowing around my ankles, I should have been the happiest woman alive. The mirror reflected a bride glowing with second chance love, ready to walk down the aisle to marry David, the man who brought sunshine back into my world after 2 long years of widowhood. My hands trembled as I adjusted my pearl necklace, the same one Robert gave me 40 years ago. Little did I know that in just 1 hour my fairy tale would shatter into 1,000 pieces, revealing a betrayal so deep it would change everything I believed about love and trust. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you believe in second chances, subscribe for more real-life stories, and let's begin this journey together, because what happened next will shock you to your core. Looking back now, I realize my story truly began 42 years ago when I married my first husband, Robert, at 22. We built a beautiful life together in our little colonial house on Maple Street, complete with a white picket fence and a garden that bloomed every spring. When I was 23, we welcomed our son Marcus, a bundle of joy, who filled our home with laughter and chaos in the most wonderful way possible. Robert was my everything, my high school sweetheart who became my partner in every sense of the word. He worked as an accountant while I taught elementary school, and together we created a routine that felt like the perfect dance. Sunday morning pancakes, evening walks around the neighborhood, family vacations to the lake every summer. We grew old together, gracefully watching Marcus graduate, get married to his college girlfriend Sophia, and bless us with our granddaughter Emma. But 2 years ago, at 62, my world crumbled when Robert suffered a massive heart attack. One moment he was laughing at a joke on television, the next he was gone. The doctor said it was quick, that he didn't suffer, but I suffered enough for both of us. The house that once echoed with our conversations became a tomb of memories, too quiet and too empty. Marcus worried about me, constantly visiting every few days with Sophia and 8-year-old Emma. Sophia, bless her heart, would bring casseroles and sit with me for hours listening to my stories about their father and grandfather. She had always been like a daughter to me, with her warm brown eyes and genuine smile that lit up every room. Emma would climb onto my lap and ask me to read her the same fairy tales I once read to her father. But the nights were the hardest. Cooking dinner for one felt pointless. Watching our favorite shows alone made me cry. I found myself talking to Robert's photograph, asking him how I was supposed to live without him. The loneliness was suffocating, like a heavy blanket I couldn't throw off. After 6 months of watching me struggle, my best friend Grace sat me down in my kitchen one Tuesday afternoon. Grace had been my neighbor for 30 years, a fiery redhead who never minced words. She poured us each a cup of coffee and looked me straight in the eye. Marcus had been telling her about his concerns for my mental health, how I barely left the house except for grocery shopping and church. Grace suggested something that made me nearly choke on my coffee: online dating. At 62 years old, she wanted me to create a profile on some website and meet strangers. The very idea seemed ridiculous, almost disrespectful to Robert's memory. But Grace persisted, explaining that Robert would want me to be happy, that I had too much love left to give to spend the rest of my life alone. It took Grace 3 weeks of gentle persuasion before I finally agreed to try. Sophia offered to help me create my profile, and we spent an entire Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table with her laptop. She helped me choose photos, write a description, and explained how the whole system worked. I felt like I was learning a foreign language, swiping left and right, matching with people who seemed nice enough in their pictures. My first few attempts at dating were disasters. There was Henry, who spent our entire coffee date talking about his ex-wife's flaws. Then came William, who seemed more interested in my house than in me asking detailed questions about my mortgage and property value. After 3 failed dates, I was ready to give up and accept that my romantic life was over. But then David's profile appeared on my screen, and something made me pause. His picture showed a distinguished man with silver hair and kind blue eyes standing in a garden full of tomatoes and sunflowers. His description mentioned that he was a widower who enjoyed cooking, reading classic novels, and tending to his vegetable garden. He had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier and was hoping to find companionship with someone who understood the complexities of loving again after loss. Our first exchange of messages felt different from the start. David wrote thoughtfully, asking about my interests, rather than immediately suggesting we meet. He told me about his late wife, Margaret, how they had traveled to Italy for their 30th anniversary, and how he learned to make authentic pasta sauce from a little old lady in Tuscany. I shared stories about Robert, our trips to the lake, and how I was learning to navigate life alone. We messaged back and forth for an entire week before he suggested meeting for coffee at a small cafe downtown. I was nervous changing my outfit 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that Sophia said brought out my eyes. When I arrived at this cafe, David was already there, standing beside a corner table with a single yellow rose. He was exactly as handsome as his picture suggested, maybe even more so in person. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that immediately put me at ease. We talked for 3 hours that first afternoon, covering everything from our children to our favorite books to our struggles with grief. David had 2 daughters who lived on the opposite coast, successful women who called him weekly but rarely visited. When he walked me to my car, David asked if I would like to have dinner with him the following weekend. I heard myself saying yes before my brain could talk me out of it. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years: excitement about the future. Our second date was even better than the first. David took me to a small Italian restaurant where the owner greeted him by name. He had been coming there since Margaret's death, he explained, because cooking for one person felt as lonely as eating alone. We shared a bottle of wine and laughed about our attempts to master technology, how our children had to teach us to use smartphones and streaming services. By our third date, I was completely smitten. David brought me flowers from his garden, beautiful arrangements that he created himself. He cooked dinner for me at his apartment, serving homemade ravioli with that famous sauce he learned in Italy. We danced slowly in his living room to Frank Sinatra, and I felt young again, like the girl who fell in love with Robert all those years ago. Marcus and Sophia met David after we had been dating for 2 months, and I was nervous about their reaction. But David charmed them immediately, bringing Emma a book of fairy tales from different countries and engaging Marcus in a lengthy discussion about baseball statistics. Sophia whispered to me later that she hadn't seen me smile so genuinely since before Robert died. 6 months into our relationship, David and I had become inseparable. We took a ballroom dancing class at the community center, where we were definitely the most enthusiastic, if not the most skilled couple. David surprised me with tickets to the opera, remembering that I had mentioned loving La Traviata when I was younger. We spent lazy Sundays cooking together, reading different sections of the newspaper, and working in my garden. David had a way of making ordinary moments feel special. He would leave little notes in my car when he borrowed it to run errands, sweet messages that made me giggle like a teenager. When I caught a terrible cold in October, he showed up at my door with homemade chicken soup and stayed to take care of me, despite my protests that he might get sick too. Our friends and family had fully embraced our relationship. Grace constantly told me how much happier I seemed, how the spark had returned to my eyes. Marcus mentioned several times how grateful he was that I had found someone who treated me well and made me laugh again. Even Emma had grown attached to David, calling him Mr. David, and insisting he read her bedtime stories whenever he was around during her sleepovers with me. But the most magical moment came on a crisp autumn day when David suggested a picnic by the lake. We spread a blanket under a maple tree whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. After we finished eating, David became unusually quiet, fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket. When he suddenly dropped to one knee in front of me, my heart nearly stopped. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. The stone caught the afternoon sunlight, sparkling like a tiny star. David's voice shook slightly as he spoke, telling me that I had brought joy back into his life when he thought he would never feel happiness again. "Barbara," he said, his blue eyes glistening with tears, "you've made me believe in love again. You've shown me that our hearts are capable of loving deeply twice in one lifetime. Will you marry me and let me spend whatever years I have left, making you as happy as you've made me?" I was crying before he finished speaking, nodding my head vigorously as I whispered yes. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for my finger. We sat by the lake until sunset, making plans for our future, talking about traveling together, and maybe moving to a smaller house that would be ours rather than mine or his. That evening, I called Marcus and Sophia to share the news. Marcus was thrilled, saying that David was exactly the kind of man he hoped I would find. Sophia squealed with excitement and immediately started talking about wedding plans, offering to help with everything from choosing a dress to selecting flowers. We decided on a small ceremony in just 2 months, February 14th, Valentine's Day. It seemed fitting for a couple who had found love later in life. David handled the legal paperwork and reserved a small chapel where he and Margaret had renewed their vows on their 25th anniversary. Pastor Williams, who had known David for years, agreed to perform the ceremony. Sophia threw herself into helping me plan every detail. We spent an entire Saturday shopping for my wedding dress, finally settling on an elegant cream-colored gown with delicate lace sleeves that made me feel beautiful rather than ridiculous for wearing white at my age. Emma was beside herself with excitement about being the flower girl, practicing her walk down the aisle in my living room every time she visited. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparation and pure joy. I felt like a young bride again, nervous and excited about starting a new chapter of my life. David and I took care of the practical matters too, meeting with lawyers about wills and discussing how we would combine our households after the honeymoon. Everything seemed perfect, like a fairy tale come true for a woman who thought her happily ever after had ended with Robert's death. But then, about 2 weeks before our wedding day, I started noticing subtle changes in David's behavior that made my stomach twist with unease. He began taking more phone calls than usual, always stepping outside or into another room to answer them. When I asked about the calls, he would brush off my questions with vague explanations about tying up loose ends before his retirement became official. David had always been attentive and present during our time together, but suddenly he seemed distracted, checking his phone frequently and responding to text messages with an urgency that felt out of character. When I tried to discuss last-minute wedding details, he would listen with half an ear, nodding absently, while his fingers tapped nervously on whatever surface was nearby. One evening, while we were having dinner at my house, David's phone rang during our meal. He glanced at the screen, and his face went pale before he quickly declined the call. But it rang again immediately, and this time he felt compelled to answer it. He excused himself and stepped onto the back porch, speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't quite make out through the glass door. When he returned to the table, David seemed shaken, claiming that there was some kind of family emergency with one of his daughters that required his immediate attention. He apologized profusely, but said he needed to leave right away to handle the situation. I offered to come with him or help in any way I could, but he insisted that it was something he had to deal with alone. The strange thing was, when I tried to call him the next day to check on the supposed family crisis, David's explanations were vague and inconsistent. He couldn't seem to remember which daughter had the emergency or what exactly the problem was. My intuition, honed by decades of marriage and motherhood, began sending up red flags that I tried desperately to ignore. Around the same time, I noticed that Sophia had become unusually distant and withdrawn. She had been so enthusiastic about helping with the wedding preparations, but suddenly she was declining invitations to go dress shopping for last-minute alterations and avoiding family dinners where David would be present. When I asked Marcus about Sophia's behavior, he explained that she had been working extra hours at her job and that Emma had been sick with a persistent cough that was keeping everyone in the house awake at night. It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but something about Sophia's avoidance felt deliberate rather than circumstantial. During the few times Sophia was around David, I noticed she could barely look at him directly. She would find excuses to leave the room when he entered, or she would busy herself with Emma or household tasks that suddenly became urgent. When forced to interact with him, Sophia's usual warm demeanor became stiff and uncomfortable. Emma, with the brutal honesty of an 8-year-old, mentioned one afternoon that her mommy had been crying a lot lately and spending long periods of time staring out the window without saying anything. When I asked Sophia about this, she dismissed it as work stress and assured me that everything was fine. 3 days before the wedding, David received another one of those mysterious phone calls during what was supposed to be our final planning dinner. This time, when he looked at his phone screen, I watched all the color drain from his face. He answered with a shaky hello and immediately walked outside to the front yard. Through the window, I could see him pacing back and forth, running his free hand through his silver hair repeatedly. His body language suggested he was either very upset or very angry about whatever he was hearing. When he came back inside after nearly 15 minutes, David was visibly shaken and claimed that he needed to go home immediately to handle urgent paperwork. He left so abruptly that he forgot his reading glasses on my coffee table, something that had never happened before. David was meticulous about his belongings and never left anything behind unintentionally. I called him that night to let him know about the glasses, but he said he would pick them up the next day and seemed eager to end our conversation quickly. The morning of February 14th dawned crisp and clear, perfect weather for a wedding. I woke up with butterflies dancing in my stomach, the kind of nervous excitement I hadn't felt since my first wedding day 42 years earlier. Grace arrived early to help me get ready, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries that she insisted I eat despite my protests that I was too nervous to be hungry. Emma bounded into my bedroom shortly after 8 o'clock, already wearing her flower girl dress and practically vibrating with excitement. She spun around my room, making the pale pink tulle of her skirt float around her like a cloud. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself laughing at her dramatic reenactments of how she planned to walk down the aisle. Sophia arrived about an hour later than we had planned, looking exhausted and strained. Her usually bright eyes were puffy and red-rimmed, as if she had been crying or hadn't slept well in days. She apologized for being late, claiming that she had spent the morning dealing with Emma's last-minute wardrobe crisis involving shoes that suddenly didn't fit properly. But when I looked at Emma's feet, the shoes fit perfectly, and she showed no signs of any earlier distress about her outfit. In fact, Emma seemed confused by her mother's explanation and started to correct her before Sophia quickly changed the subject to my hair and makeup schedule. Grace, ever the observant friend, raised her eyebrows at me when Sophia wasn't looking. She had clearly noticed the inconsistency in the story as well, but we both decided to focus on the positive aspects of the day rather than worry about whatever was bothering Sophia. As Sophia helped me step into my wedding dress, I noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she worked the tiny pearl buttons up the back of the gown. When I asked if she was feeling all right, she gave me a weak smile and claimed that she was just emotional about seeing me so happy and beautiful on my wedding day. But there was something in Sophia's eyes that looked more like guilt than joy, a heaviness that seemed completely at odds with the celebratory atmosphere we were trying to create. She kept glancing at her phone, checking the time compulsively as if she were waiting for something specific to happen. Emma, with her uncomplicated 8-year-old perspective, made an observation that sent a chill down my spine. "Mommy has been sad for a long time now," she said matter-of-factly while Grace was fixing my veil. "She cries when she thinks I'm not looking, and she talks to herself in the bathroom." Sophia quickly hushed her daughter and redirected her attention to the flowers, but I caught Grace's eye in the mirror and saw my own concern reflected in her expression. Something was definitely wrong, and it was becoming harder to pretend otherwise. 45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I realized I had forgotten my small pearl clutch in the bridal preparation room down the hall. Grace was busy with the last-minute touches to my makeup, and Sophia was helping Emma practice her flower petal tossing technique, so I decided to retrieve the purse myself. As I walked down the hallway, gathering the train of my dress to avoid tripping, I felt excited and nervous about seeing David at the altar, in just under an hour. My heart was full of love and anticipation for the new life we were about to begin together. But when I opened the door to the preparation room, I discovered something that would change everything. There on the chair where I had been sitting earlier was David's cell phone, apparently dropped and forgotten in his nervousness about the approaching ceremony. The screen was illuminated with a new text message, and without thinking, I glanced down at it. What I saw made my blood turn to ice in my veins. The message was from Sophia, and it read simply but devastatingly, "We need to tell her today." My hands began shaking as I picked up the phone, knowing I was about to cross a line, but unable to stop myself. I opened the message thread between David and Sophia, and what I discovered there shattered my world into a million pieces. With trembling fingers, I scrolled up through the conversation history between David and my daughter-in-law, each message I read making my heart sink deeper into despair. The thread went back months filled with exchanges that revealed a secret relationship that had been happening right under my nose. "I can't keep lying to Barbara anymore," Sophia had written 3 days earlier. "She trusts me completely, and I feel sick every time I look at her." David's response was cold and calculating. "Just get through today, and then we can figure out how to handle everything else. We've come too far to back out now." "But she loves you genuinely," Sophia had replied. "She talks about you constantly, about how happy you make her. This isn't right." My legs felt weak as I continued reading, discovering messages that went back to November, just 1 month after David had proposed to me. Sophia had written, "I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you since that night we talked in the garden." David had responded, "I feel the same way. You understand me in a way that Barbara never could. She's sweet, but you're passionate and alive." The messages became more intimate as I scrolled back further with declarations of love and longing that made me physically nauseated. "I love you," David had written to Sophia in December. "After I marry Barbara, we can be together more openly. She'll never suspect anything." But the most devastating message was one I found from just last week. David had written, "She has money and property, Sophia. This marriage will secure our future together. The house alone is worth more than enough to set us up for life." Sophia's response showed at least some conscience. "I hate that we're using her like this. She's been nothing but kind to me since Marcus and I got married." "Sometimes we have to be practical about love," David had replied. "Barbara had her great love with Robert. Now it's our turn to have ours, and she's going to make it possible whether she knows it or not." I sank into the chair, still holding David's phone, as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. The man I was about to marry had been having an affair with my daughter-in-law for months, and they were both planning to continue their relationship after our wedding. David didn't love me at all. He was marrying me for my money and property planning, to use me as a stepping stone to his real happiness with Sophia. The worst part was realizing that Sophia, the young woman I had loved like my own daughter, had been lying to my face for months. Every time she had helped me plan my wedding, every moment she had spent listening to me gush about my happiness with David, she had been betraying me in the most fundamental way possible. I sat there in my wedding dress feeling like the biggest fool in the world. All those phone calls David had been taking, all those times Sophia had seemed distant and uncomfortable, the crying spells that Emma had noticed, it all made sense now. The two people I trusted most in the world, besides my own son, had been conspiring against me. For several minutes, I just held the phone and cried, ruining the makeup that Grace had so carefully applied. I thought about all the red flags I had ignored, all the times my intuition had tried to warn me that something wasn't right. I had been so desperate to believe in my second chance at love that I had willfully blinded myself to the truth. But then, as I sat there in that empty room, something inside me shifted from devastation to determination. I was not going to let these two people make a fool of me any longer. I was not going to stand at that altar and promise to love and honor a man who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. I was going to expose their betrayal in front of everyone they had helped deceive. David and Sophia were about to learn that a 64-year-old woman could be far more formidable than they had ever imagined. I took several deep breaths to compose myself, wiped my tears carefully to avoid smearing what remained of my makeup, and formulated a plan. First, I called Pastor Williams and told him there would be a brief delay in the ceremony due to an unexpected situation that needed to be addressed. He was concerned and offered to help, but I assured him that everything would be resolved shortly. Next, I called Grace and asked her to meet me in the preparation room immediately, telling her to leave Emma with one of the other guests, but not to bring Sophia. When Grace arrived and saw my expression, she knew instantly that something terrible had happened. "What's wrong?" she asked, closing the door behind her. I handed her David's phone with the message thread still open. "Read this," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. Grace's face went through the same progression of shock, disbelief, and fury that mine had experienced just minutes earlier. She sank into a chair beside me, shaking her head as she scrolled through the messages. "That son of a—" Grace caught herself before finishing the curse, but her eyes were blazing with anger. "How could they do this to you? How could Sophia betray you like this after everything you've done for her and Marcus?" "I don't know," I replied, "but I'm not going to let them get away with it. I'm going to expose them right here, right now, in front of everyone." Grace looked concerned about my plan for public confrontation, but when I explained exactly what I intended to do, she nodded grimly and agreed to support me. We quickly discussed the logistics, and then I asked her to discreetly gather all the wedding guests in the main area of the chapel. With David's phone in my hand as evidence, I walked out of the preparation room and down the hallway toward the chapel's main area. My heart was pounding, but not with the nervous excitement of a bride, rather with the righteous anger of a woman who refused to be victimized. I could see David standing near the altar, looking handsome in his navy blue suit, chatting nervously with Pastor Williams. Marcus was beside him, probably offering words of encouragement and support for his mother's new husband. The cruel irony of the scene made my stomach churn. Sophia was seated in the front row, still looking pale and distressed, with Emma beside her fidgeting with her flower basket. The other guests, maybe 30 people total, were seated and waiting expectantly for the ceremony to begin. "Excuse me, everyone," I called out, my voice carrying clearly through the small chapel. "Could I have your attention for just a moment before we begin?" David looked up and saw me standing there with his phone in my hand. The color drained from his face so quickly that I thought he might faint. He started walking toward me, probably hoping to intercept whatever I was about to say. "Darling, you look absolutely beautiful," he said, reaching for the phone. I was wondering where I had left that. I stepped back, keeping the device out of his reach. "I'm sure you were wondering," I replied, my voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "especially since you've been receiving such interesting messages." The chapel fell completely silent, except for the sound of David's sharp intake of breath. Marcus looked confused, glancing between his mother and his stepfather-to-be. Sophia had gone completely white and was gripping the edge of the pew so tightly that her knuckles were visible. "Barbara," David said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "whatever you think you've seen—" "Oh, I know exactly what I've seen," I interrupted, holding up his phone. "I've seen months of text messages between you and my daughter-in-law. I've seen your declarations of love for each other. I've seen your plans to continue your affair after our marriage. And I've seen your real reason for marrying me, which has absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with my financial assets." The gasp that went up from the assembled guests was audible, and I saw Marcus's face transform from confusion to horror as he began to understand what I was revealing. "Sophia," Marcus said, turning to look at his wife with an expression of complete bewilderment. Sophia finally broke down completely, burying her face in her hands and sobbing openly. "I'm sorry," she managed between tears. "I'm so sorry, Barbara. Marcus, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." David made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said desperately. "Those messages, they're not what they seem. but I had heard enough lies from both of them to last a lifetime. Would you like me to read some of these messages aloud? I asked, raising my voice so that everyone in the chapel could hear me clearly. Should I share the one where you tell Sophia that I'll never suspect your affair, or perhaps the one where you calculate how much my house is worth? The aftermath of my revelation was swift and devastating. David stopped trying to deny the evidence when he realized that everyone had heard enough to understand the scope of his betrayal. He stood there, in his wedding suit, looking like a man whose carefully constructed house of cards had just collapsed around him. Marcus confronted Sophia directly, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded. "How long have you been lying to all of us?" Sophia could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to confirm that the affair had started in November, just weeks after my engagement to David. She tried to explain that it had begun innocently with David offering her comfort during a particularly difficult period in her marriage to Marcus, but that their emotional connection had quickly turned physical. The wedding guests began filing out quietly, some stopping to offer me words of support, and others simply too embarrassed by the spectacle to say anything. Pastor Williams approached me with genuine concern, asking if there was anything he could do to help me through this difficult moment. "Thank you, Pastor," I said, "but I think the most helpful thing you can do is cancel this wedding permanently." David made one final attempt to speak with me privately, but I refused to hear any more of his excuses or apologies. "The only thing you can do for me now is disappear from my life completely," I told him. "Take your lies and your schemes and get out of my sight." Grace stayed by my side throughout the confrontation, providing both physical and emotional support as my world crumbled and rebuilt itself simultaneously. Emma, confused by all the adult drama happening around her, clung to my dress and asked if I was still going to be her grandmother, even though the wedding wasn't happening. "Of course, sweetheart," I assured her, kneeling down to give her a hug. "You're my granddaughter no matter what happens between the grown-ups." Marcus was devastated by the dual betrayal of his wife and the man he had welcomed as a stepfather. He apologized repeatedly for not seeing the signs, for not protecting me from people who had used his trust to hurt me. I assured him that none of this was his fault, that we had all been deceived by two people we had every reason to trust. As the chapel emptied, I stood there in my wedding dress, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered dreams, but also filled with a strange sense of relief. I had discovered the truth before making the biggest mistake of my life. I had found the courage to stand up for myself and expose the people who had been manipulating me. Grace drove me home while I was still wearing my wedding dress, and we sat in my kitchen drinking coffee as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "It took tremendous courage to do what you did today." "I felt like such a fool," I admitted. "All the signs were there, and I ignored them because I wanted so desperately to believe in love again." "You weren't a fool," Grace replied firmly. "You were a woman who chose to trust people who didn't deserve your trust. That's their failing, not yours." The days following my wedding day disaster were some of the darkest I had experienced since Robert's death. The humiliation of being deceived so completely, combined with the loss of both David and Sophia from my life, left me feeling hollow and defeated. Grace stayed with me for the first week, making sure I ate and encouraging me to get out of bed each morning. Marcus came to see me every day, bringing Emma when Sophia was at work, and they could avoid the awkward encounters that had become their new normal. He told me that he had asked Sophia to move out temporarily while they figured out whether their marriage could survive her betrayal. He was struggling not just with her affair, but with the way she had used their family relationships to deceive me. "She betrayed you just as much as she betrayed me," Marcus said during one of our conversations. "You trusted her like a daughter, and she used that trust to hurt you in the worst possible way." Sophia sent a long letter of apology that I wasn't ready to read for several weeks. When I finally opened it, I found a rambling explanation of how lonely and neglected she had felt in her marriage, how David had made her feel special and desired in ways that Marcus hadn't in years. She claimed that she had tried to end the affair multiple times, but that David had convinced her they deserved to be happy together. The letter revealed that David had been the driving force behind the scheme to use me for my financial assets. Sophia admitted that she had initially been reluctant to continue seeing him after my engagement, but he had convinced her that I was better off not knowing the truth, that I would be happier believing in our fairy tale romance than facing the reality of being alone again. I was disgusted by the patronizing assumption that I couldn't handle the truth about my own life, that I needed to be protected from reality like a child. The condescending tone of Sophia's explanations made me angrier than the affair itself. But slowly, very slowly, I began to heal. I returned to my garden, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing plants and watching them grow. I rejoined my book club, where the other members welcomed me back with warmth and understanding. I started taking yoga classes at the community center, discovering that physical movement helped quiet the angry voices in my mind. Marcus and I grew closer through our shared experience of betrayal. We spent hours talking about trust and forgiveness, about how to move forward when the people you love most disappoint you in fundamental ways. He was trying to rebuild his marriage through counseling, but he was honest about how difficult it was to look at Sophia without remembering what she had done to both of us. 3 months after the wedding that never was, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to forgive Sophia, not because she deserved it, but because carrying hatred and resentment was poisoning my own ability to heal and move forward. I didn't forgive David, whose calculated manipulation and mercenary motives left no room for understanding or compassion. But Sophia was young and had made a terrible mistake that she would have to live with for the rest of her life. She had lost my trust completely, and our relationship would never be what it once was, but I could release my anger toward her. The forgiveness wasn't for her benefit. It was for mine, and for Emma's, and for the possibility that Marcus might be able to rebuild his family if that's what he chose to do. 6 months after my wedding day revelation, I woke up one morning and realized that I felt lighter than I had in years. Not just since the David debacle, but lighter than I had felt even during our relationship. I had learned to trust my own instincts again, to value my own judgment over my desperate desire to be loved. I started volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching adults to read. I found tremendous satisfaction in helping people unlock new possibilities for their lives. I also began attending a support group for people who had experienced relationship betrayal, where I met others who understood the specific pain of being deceived by someone you trusted completely. One day, while working in my garden, I realized that I no longer felt bitter about what David and Sophia had done to me. Their betrayal had been a gift in disguise, saving me from a marriage built on lies and financial manipulation. I had discovered reserves of strength and courage that I didn't know I possessed. The experience taught me that being alone was far preferable to being with someone who didn't value me for who I truly was. I learned that my worth wasn't dependent on having a romantic partner, that I could create a rich and meaningful life surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. I also learned to trust the warning signals that I had ignored during my relationship with David. My intuition had been trying to protect me all along, but I had been so afraid of being alone that I had silenced my own inner voice. Now, as I sit in my garden on this beautiful spring morning, watching my roses bloom for the first time since Robert planted them 15 years ago, I feel grateful for the journey that brought me to this place of peace and self-acceptance. I'm not closed to the possibility of love in the future, but I will never again compromise my standards or ignore red flags for the sake of companionship. Any man who wants to be part of my life will have to earn my trust through consistent actions and genuine character, not through smooth words and romantic gestures. The truth is, I'm happy with who I am and the life I've built. I have a son who loves and respects me, a granddaughter who brings joy to every day she spends with me, and friends who support me through both triumph and disaster. I have a home that I love, work that gives me purpose, and the hard-earned wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing forgiveness over bitterness. Sometimes the greatest gift life can give us is showing us who people really are before we make irreversible commitments to them. My wedding day disaster was actually my wedding day salvation, and for that I will always be grateful. What do you think? Have you ever experienced a betrayal that initially felt devastating, but ultimately led to something better in your life? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more real-life stories about resilience and second chances. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us turns out to be exactly what we needed. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth is never determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. May you always have the courage to choose truth over comfortable lies, and may you find the peace that comes from knowing your own value.